Hi guys, today we're going to talk about brown algae. It's the last group we're going to talk about in the Strammonophylla. I'm coming from you outside because my house is being dismembered right now. It's way too noisy to be in there. Okay, so this isn't going to be a long lecture. What do I want you to get from it? I want you to understand what the Phyophaceae are, what the brown algae are, how they are related to other groups, and a little bit about their ecology. Now for the test, the quiz tomorrow, please make sure that you read the section in your text on brown algae. It's not very long, but it's important because some of the material in that will be on your quiz. Okay, so what do we need to know? We're still in the Strammonophylla, right? We're still over here. We've already talked about the Strammonophylla a lot. We talked about the Oomycota early in the semester. We talked about diatoms, golden algae, yellow-green algae, and now we're talking about brown algae, otherwise known as Phyophaceae. They're still in the heteroconophyta, right? Different classification systems, but they still have those wonky two flagellar. They're still in the same group we talked about for the last two classes. And they are a product of secondary endosymbiosis. Okay, so most of you, when you think of Phyophaceae, if you think of them at all, you do think about them. They're what you see when you go to the ocean, right? These are the organisms that wash up on the beach that you get tangled in. These are a big part of marine ecosystems, and they are really complicated organisms compared to the other groups that we've seen so far this year. These guys are like, they look and function like plants. They're not plants, but they function very similar to plants. There's about 1,500 species. They're brown because of a pigment called fucoxanthin. And yeah, there's all sorts of different kinds. We're going to talk about Macrocystis, Fucus, and Laminaria today. I'm pretty sure you've seen these. Laminaria is a kelp, right? And there's tons of these guys on the West Coast. Now they've got a more complex body structure than we've seen so far, in that they've got a holdfast, which is this little section at the bottom that holds them to the substrate, a stipe, which is like the stem, and then a blade. Now it's not called a leaf because it's not technically a leaf, but it functions very similar to the leaf. It's just an elongated photosynthetic collecting or an appendage designed to collect photons for photosynthesis. I mean, they're not wildly complicated, but they're pretty complex, as you'll see. So this is Macrocystis, and it is harvested on the West Coast. It lives on the surface of the water, and it's harvested, especially in California, it's harvested as a source of iodine and mannitol. Mannitol is a carbohydrate that's used as a sugar substitute. And it's not really that destructive to harvest it because the meristematic region, so where it regrows from, is between the stem and the blade. So even if you cut it off, it will regenerate. What else do I talk about? Oh, air bladders, right? So this is Fucus. You guys have probably all seen Fucus, and you've all probably popped these air bubbles. Some of them are really hard to pop. You have to stomp on them. These allow these heavier plant-like organisms, these heavier algae, to float on the surface of the water, so they'll collect more photons. Yeah, so they've got these specialized structures. Now, what I really want to talk about are giant kelps. These are the equivalent of trees, really. They're as tall as some of the world's tallest trees. Imagine 60 meters tall. They form underwater forests. They really create these elaborate ecosystems in marine. And you think, well, how can an organism 60 meters tall function, right? Because you imagine if the photosynthetic apparatuses are at the top and the rest of the organism is 60 meters down, how is it getting nutrients? Well, it's got conductive tissue, and this is really unusual in the Strammonophylla and in protists in general. They have specialized internal cells that function like phloem. Now, I can't call them phloem because they're not phloem. They don't come from the same evolutionary place that phloem cells come from. And they're not as complicated as phloem, but they act like phloem, and they can conduct nutrients up and down the plant at a rate of about 60 centimeters an hour. And if you look at them in transverse section, it looks like a sieve plate from a phloem cell. So very, very similar, but this is an example of convergent evolution, right? They don't have the same evolutionary origins. They're different evolutionary events, but they resulted in the same functional and the same morphological capabilities. Okay, and it allowed these kelps to become so huge. Now, in this group, we see both sporic and gametic meiosis. I'm going to talk about sporic first because these organisms look so much like plants, and some of them have a life cycle almost identical to plants, like this one. This is from your text. Now, remember, sporic meiosis happens in the sporophyte. So the sporophyte is the big diploid thing that we see that's growing in the ocean that we can pick up and eat or do whatever we want with it. In the blade are sporangia that are embedded, right? And they're not that complicated, right? They're sporangia with haploid zoospores. Now these zoospores are released into the ocean, and they are either male or female genetically. They look the same though. They both got flagella. They're isomorphic. They look identical, but they germinate into a tiny little gametophyte, a male or female gametophyte. And this is exactly what we see in plants, right? It's big sporophyte, tiny gametophyte. And the male gametophyte forms antheridia, which creates sperm cells, which then swim over to the bigger egg cells in the female gametophyte, and the life cycle continues. This is very, very similar to our plant life cycle. The only difference is the sporangia in plants are more complicated, right? They come from flowers or cones, but otherwise they're pretty much the same. Now I think I have probably some questions on the quiz about this, right? Is this organism, for example, is it hetero or homomorphic, right? Did the plants look the same at both life cycle stages? Well, no, they're heteromorphic or anisomorphic, same thing, because the sporophyte looks very, very different than the gametophyte. Sporophyte's big, gametophyte's still multicellular, but it's tiny. Isogamous, anisogamous, well, even though, don't confuse the zoospores with the gametes, because these aren't the gametes, these are the zoospores that give rise to the gametophytes. The gametes come from the gametophytes, and these are definitely anisogamous, right? The sperms are little and flagellate. The eggs are big and non-flagellate. So, and in this case, it's oogamy because you've got one big sedentary egg cell and a tiny little motile sperm cell. Okay, so that's one example of sporic meiosis. Fucus has gametic meiosis, right? And if you remember, gametic meiosis is when meiosis happens in the gametes themselves. So you don't have a big gametophyte. You have a very, very small gametophyte individual. And you can see that here, right? So the big fucus that we see, and we pop the air bubbles, that's a sporophyte. The gametophyte is inside, it's kind of retained on the sporophyte, and meiosis happens in this example. Female cell is going to give rise to the female gamete. Meiosis happens in there and goes straight to the egg cells, right? There's no gametophyte generation. Same thing with the antheridia. These male cells, these antheridia, undergo meiosis and give rise to sperm cells. And here again, so here they're heteromorphic, right? The gametophyte generation is pretty much just one cell. And we've got anisogamy, which is also oogamy, right? Big egg cell, no flagella, tiny little sperm cell, flagellate. Okay, so even though these plants are very, very similar, the reproduction is quite different. I called them plants, they're not plants, but I think of them as plants because they function this way. All right, and I just wanted to remind you what gametic meiosis is, right? There's one cell that gives rise to the gametes, so you don't have a multicellular gametophyte generation. This is all in your text. Go over it again. I think life cycles are important to understand. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do today is talk to you about kelp forests because they are so beautiful, they're so wonderful, and we in British Columbia have a huge amount of the world's kelp forests. Right, all along the west coast from Baja to the archipelago in Alaska is a giant elongated kelp forest. And this is the kelp. I'm sure you've seen it. And it creates these forests, but it's not just one like this homogeneous, it's massive algae. It is stratified like a forest. It's got canopy kelps, it's got stipate kelps, it's got prostrate kelps, benthos kelps. So it has kelps living at each level of of the marine ecosystem where there is light penetrating. And these are the source of nutrients for all sorts of other organisms, right? And they're really, really rich environments. Now, it's one of the most predictive ecosystems on Earth. And if you look at productivity, right, red is the highest productivity that's recorded, right? And it's these areas, right, wherever we see a kelp forest. Now, kelp forests are also home to all sorts of creatures, right? All sorts of cnidarians, all sorts of echinoderms like urchins, and all sorts of mammals, whales, tortoises, and otters. I don't know how many of you are lucky to have seen a sea otter. I see river otters maybe once every couple of years, which are incredibly cute. I saw one in the Mission, on the Mission Greenway last year. So cute. Oh my God. Okay, but we're not talking about river otters. We're talking about marine otters. And for years and years and years, they were, I've got these slides I want to show you. They were hunted in the 1800s and 1900s, and they were completely extinct. They became extinct in Canada because they were hunted for their pelts, but also because they continued to be hunted in the 20th century because they were thought to be competing with the fishing industry for fish. However, and otters do eat fish. It's true, they eat fish, but they love urchins. And so here is an example of what happens. Kelp forest with sea otters, nice normal ecosystem. Without otters, urchins population explode, eat the kelp, ecosystem collapses. So this is an example where otters are a keystone species. They are absolutely necessary to keep these kelp forests healthy and productive. Now, in the late 1900s, in the 60s and 70s, 89 sea otters were reintroduced into Canada. Today, there's about 6,000. So I've never seen one, but there are about 6,000 in Canada today, so you can perhaps see them. And oh my goodness, I don't know about you, but I think sea otters are among the cutest organisms ever. Maybe not the cutest, because that's Grover, but yeah. Okay, so not a big lecture today, just want to introduce you to the kelps, and that's all I have to say. So sorry for getting this up so late, but my house is it is a war zone. It's a bloodbath. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's really ugly in there. All right, have a good day. I will talk to you